Kabul, Afghanistan. After abruptly axing nearly a year of delicate peace talks with the Taliban in September, President Trump put the negotiations back on the front burner this week in a similarly jolting fashion by seeming to demand a ceasefire that his negotiators had long concluded was overly ambitious. The Taliban wants to make a deal. And we're meeting with them, and we're saying it has to be a ceasefire, Mr. Trump said during a Thanksgiving visit with the troops at Bagram Airfield, the largest American military installation in the country. Mr. Trump's remarks appeared to be a big shift in the American position. And despite a sense of relief at the prospect of resuming talks to end the 18-year conflict, Western diplomats and Taliban leaders were scrambling to figure out whether Mr. Trump had set a new goal for negotiations. A ceasefire would amount to a significant new concession from the Taliban, one that the Americans have little leverage to extract. For much of the year-long talks, the Taliban and the United States were fundamentally on the same page. The Taliban wanted the Americans out of Afghanistan, and Mr. Trump has made no secret his desire to end what he has called America's unending wars. But agreeing upon the details of a deal proved complicated. In the agreement the two sides were on the verge of finalizing before Mr. Trump pulled the plug. The best the American negotiators could get the Taliban to consent to was some reduction in violence. Discussions on a comprehensive ceasefire were relegated to future talks between the Taliban and Afghan leaders only after the United States had pledged, and begun, to withdraw its troops. But on Thursday, Mr. Trump suggested the Taliban position had shifted. They didn't want to do a ceasefire, but now they do want to do a ceasefire, I believe, he said. And it will probably work out that way. And we'll see what happens. The Taliban seemed surprised by Mr. Trump's declaration. While the group's negotiators have held informal meetings with United States diplomats in recent weeks about ways to go back to the table, on Friday their leaders said their original position on a ceasefire had not changed. The Americans walked away from the negotiating table, and now the ball is in their side. It is up to them to come back if they want to solve this and get the document to signing and to the stage of implementation, Suhail Shaheen, a member of the Taliban's negotiation team, told the New York Times. Our positions remain the same. It's unclear how American negotiators could get the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire now, when they were not able to do so earlier. The American military has already begun scaling back its presence in the country, giving negotiators even less leverage than they had before. Last month, the top American commander in Afghanistan, General Austin S. Miller, said the number of troops had been reduced by 2,000 over the past year. President Trump, on Thursday, said he was bringing down the number of troops substantially. For the Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, Mr. Trump's statements were welcome. For months, Mr. Ghani had unsuccessfully tried to persuade the Americans not to give away an American troop withdrawal without a ceasefire because that would leave his government even more vulnerable. The government has already been weakened by being excluded from the talks so far because the Taliban refused to engage before an American troop withdrawal. Now, suddenly, the American president gave Mr. Ghani's position a boost at a difficult time for him, when he is stuck in a bitter fight over his re-election in a disputed vote, which is tipping the country to crisis. Mr. Ghani met with Mr. Trump at the Bagram Airfield on the eve of large protests by supporters of his rival, Abdullah. Much of the Afghan capital was under a lockdown by security forces on Friday morning as thousands marched to a roundabout behind the presidential palace demanding fraudulent votes be thrown out. Mr. Abdullah accuses the country's election commission of including 300,000 questionable votes in favor of Mr. Ghani. Mr. Ghani and Mr. Abdullah are partners in a coalition government brokered by the United States when a similar disputed election between the two went to a stalemate in 2014. The current power dispute dividing the country has added to the complications of resuming the peace efforts. The hope is that peace talks would